William. 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 He gets a bit scared sometimes. William. This is William. William is our workshop mascot. He's been living on the pillar drill for the last 15 years. So you can see he's slightly dusty. William actually makes sure that we all go home with 10 fingers and 2 eyes. My real title is Objects Conservator, is something I generally like. We all rot, we all change. We try to manage deterioration. That's really the real essence of it. Apply that and that actually strengthens the timber then. Because at the moment it will just crumble under your chisel. We started in 1999. This was, again, a mad idea. Why would you do this at the edge of Europe, as far away from your clients as you can ever be? But we established ourselves as one of the leading workshops in the country to preserve and conserve Irish heritage. So we've worked really on anything from Mary's kitchen chair to the gates of Kilmainham Jail here. The variety is rather large. You never know what's going to happen. That's the great thing. Isn't it? Yeah, he agrees.
We've noticed over the last 10 or so years a huge interest in Shackleton and his story. And on that basis, we've been kind of turning towards creating a dedicated Shackleton museum here in Athy. We have an opportunity now to acquire a very special artefact. The family over in Norway have sent us across some images they took a number of years ago. And this appears to show what they describe as Shackleton's cabin in the garden of their property. It's actually the cabin which Shackleton died from Shackleton's last ship called the Quest. If this is the true cabin which he died in, I mean, it's like the holy grail of Antarctic artifacts.
Yes.
Now, the reason why Shackleton is so important to us here in Athy is that he was born only 7 miles from this museum in 1874 in a place called Kilkee. He's often described as a British explorer, but actually he was very much an Irish man. His family were here since the 1720s. If we could have the cabin which he actually breathed his last breaths, ought to be extraordinary for us.
Yeah. I'm speechless. Shackleton on his way out, fag in his hand, waving his hat, big smile on his face. He was 47. The Quest expedition, which was his last and his 4th expedition, is not well known. So hopefully it will help people to understand what the man went through.
It's actually up in northern Norway, north of the Arctic Circle. So the logistics of getting it back to Ireland are going to be extraordinarily challenging.
What we're after is to find as many details as possible to make absolutely sure that we're dealing with the original cabin. As with most subject matters, only when you start diving into it, you actually realize how deep it is.
Sir Ernest Shackleton, explorer and poet, died on an Antarctic voyage, 5,000 miles from home. His ship, the Quest, drove on into the polar ice.
On the 5th of January 1922, Shackleton died in Grytviken, which is in South Georgia. Eventually, when the boat returned, as usual with all the expeditions, they owed a bit of money. The boat had to be sold. The boat went back to Norway, where it came from, and on the shipyard, they took this cabin off the deck.
This is the shipyard where my grandfather had.
One of the men working in the shipyard said, "I'll have that." And he used it as a garden shed for 90 years and was passed down in the family until eventually Ulf Bakker passed it on to Athy.
You're happy that the cabin is going to a good home?
Yeah.
Good.
For sure.
So it's quite a story.
Are you going to be sorry to see the cabin go from your garden?
Yes, I will be crying.
Will you be crying?
Nearly crying.
Oh,
yes,
no,
yes.
okay.
The cabin in which Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton died has been shipped to Ireland. It'll be restored in Galway before being taken to his birthplace for permanent exhibition.
Wow. It's great to have her finally here, and they all seem very healthy, and we can start the work. So the other half, that half was occupied by Frank Wild, his second in command, and then Shackleton was on this side. Everybody would expect him to die in crevasse or being eaten by strange animals or drowning, but he just died in his bed. And pretty much the procedure with objects coming in are very similar. So the first thing we do is to investigate. Just by looking. I mean, just go in there and spend many hours in there to really look at every part, how is it constructed, with lots of sketches. Wow. A lot of our clients have a very deep and intimate connection with their objects. I don't get personally connected. Sometimes you might get carried away. Luckily, I always try to hold myself back and just say, listen, it's just a wooden box. Especially on this subject matter, it's heavily romanticized. We spend many, many, many weeks in the research. Base everything I see and find on evidence. The outside, 2 inches there. It's not often that I can actually stand inside an object. Really looking forward to this journey, the quest of the quest. We were very lucky that we had a very good image of the interior of Shackleton's cabin in the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. This photo was definitely stage set for this purpose. I don't think his bed linen would be that immaculately white. So I think this must have been at the beginning of the journey or very early on. It's a rectangular space, the bunk on the left, and straight ahead you have a little cabinet with an elliptical mirror, and on the right-hand wall is a bookcase. Shackleton was a keen reader, and he encouraged all his crew as well to read. Underneath it is a washstand, and there's another very small little glass support, I would call it, next to his bed. So I know that the backboards are 160 millimeters, so I can transfer those measurements and in the end measure everything within the cabin. And that will help us then to actually rebuild these pieces to scale and make sure it looks pretty much identical to the image. So let's make it 32 inches. Without that photograph, we wouldn't even have a journey, I think. It would be just a garden shed. And I would not be involved in inventing something that could have been in there. Now, the depth of it, often you find something and that gives you a lead and you just keep on going. It's a bit like a crime scene investigation, you could call it. So as part of the research, we recently found this new source. Just by pure coincidence, I found this amazing blog which followed the Quest expedition. Miraculously, some of these images appeared that I had never seen before, because there's only a very small amount of images available. John Quiller Rowett the man who actually financed the quest expedition, visited the boat in Southampton in the shipyard, and his visit was documented with these photographs. Really interesting and very, very important documents. And to have them is just fantastic. I was so surprised that I contacted the man behind it.
It's actually the grandson of John Quiller Rowett.
Jan Czarceki. The fact that after 100 years this has now come to light is very exciting. So your grandfather knew Shackleton from Dulwich College?
They weren't in the same year. They were 2 years different, so Shackleton were 2 years senior to my grandfather. And so that, they weren't best buddies, that kind of thing, but they walked the same route to school. Rolling forward to 1920, which is when Shackleton, really had the urge to get away again. So he planned an expedition to the Arctic to go in summer of 1921, Northern Hemisphere. Come the beginning of May, it was still hadn't got the funding, and really getting too late to go north in that summer. He approached my grandfather and said, can you help? My grandfather was by that time a wealthy, established businessman in wine and spirits. June the 2nd, there's a dinner at the Savoy, and on this menu card, penguins are drawn, which says they're going south. So because it's too late to go north.
And obviously he has sufficient funds as well, because it was, a very large amount of money.
Yeah, equivalent these days is about 5 million. And it was a big commitment. Late decision, cancel the Arctic, go to the Antarctic, but also puts pressure on the timing.
Yes.
Because you've got to get ready in 3 months to go south. The quest, which is by this time being fitted for the north, has got to be refitted to go south.
As you said, they want an enormous time pressure to get this all together, and it's quite evident as well in the techniques they used, how they jointed the materials.
I don't think it ever got properly ocean tested. I think excitement, adventure, that's what they signed up for. He was lecturing twice daily on his old exploits, and it was all getting a bit of a bore. Shackleton was very keen to get away.
So this is the lock of Shackleton's cabin. Pretty much standard door locks. Every time he grabbed this door handle, I'm sure he was relieved, having a bit of sleep. The story was told to me when I collected this cabin in Norway. The school kids would hear the story about Shackleton and the connection with Amundsen, and they would just go along and paint this. You could say it's not the original paint, but it definitely helped reducing the amount of moisture that would go into the timber, so therefore there would be less chance of rot. This is just a very small paint flake, but I'm sure it's very representative of all the paint that was in this area. Some people say this is destructive, but I think on this object, it's a responsible thing. Because we only have black and white photographs, it will tell us quite a lot about its past. The first layer is a kind of a grayish, light grayish layer with lots of black pigment particles. There's some orange particles in there. How did they get in there? We go up, there's one more layer which is kind of light gray, and then there's a very thin blue layer, and then the top is the white, which I would say is the modern white the kids from the school actually applied. So the original color was just a kind of a lightish gray. Wow, that's interesting. Also the other layer, like the light blue, we have to think about that this cabin was used as a garden shed for another 90 years afterwards. They painted it light blue as well. Those paint layers are kind of an evidence of that. We do that quite a lot on objects to actually help us to understand what happened to these objects and how they were treated.
Nordpol, Südpol, ewiges Eis. Kälte, monatelange Nacht, monatelanger Tag. Geheimnisse.
We didn't have many vinyls at home, but it's amazing that picture, obviously, I must have looked at it a lot, very strong in my memory. The words are actually etched in my brain, and even if it's 40 years ago, I think I can remember it.
Schwer lastet auf uns allen der Zweifel. Werden wir die Ersten sein?
It's called The Race to the South Pole by Scott and Amundsen. So Scott was the Englishman and Amundsen was the Norwegian. Scott embraced the more modern way with motorized sleds. Amundsen, being a Norwegian, totally embraced the Inuit technology. So he had dog sleds, skis, his outfits were made out of sealskin. Scott obviously had a lot of technical problems. And when Scott then arrived at the South Pole, he saw the Norwegian flag. Amundsen was there before Scott, I think about 4 weeks earlier. Amundsen is known as the first man on the South Pole. Scott and his crew never made it back.
Gottes Willen. Sorgt für ihre Hinterbliebenen.
So it's actually quite dramatic. I would say for an 8-year-old, it would be quite touching, I would say. It's a lot about death and suffering. But again, they all have this goal of getting to a place. One man who achieved his goals in the modern era is Sir Ranulph Fiennes. He's regarded as one of the greatest living explorers. And one of his many accomplishments was that he became the first man to cross the Antarctic continent unsupported. I brought some images because I have some very specific questions, and I would really appreciate your opinion on this.
Okay.
So this is the cabin, which I just put on the deck because the quest was relatively small. So Frank Wild was next door, so you have the partitioning wall in the middle. So when I measured, the position of that wall was to the millimeter accurately in the center of this cabin. It's quite, I thought, significant that everything was built roughly, except for the placing of the wall, which was ultra-accurate, split in half.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. He had the most remarkable ability to keep worrying about other people when he himself was suffering dreadfully.
Even if he was called the boss, there was a lot of equality there and respect. So the Endurance was his third expedition, the one before the quest. By that time, the South Pole was reached. So the next big step would have been to cross the entire Antarctic continent, which was a massive undertaking. The Endurance got caught in the pack ice, which was particularly bad that year. And they were then sitting on an ice floe for over 10 months. I mean, you can't even imagine what life would be.
Shackleton was an amazingly strong character. In terms of leading men under miserable conditions, brilliant.
What they would give him wasn't that almost an automatic reaction to what you would give the man back that would totally believe in you?
Yeah, the boss. And that developed slowly. It wasn't just because one person called him the boss. They all began after the sinking of the ship to realize that his real test he was succeeding in.
Eventually the ice floe did break up, and they managed with lifeboats to just about get to Elephant Island, which is a tiny little heap of rocks. He selected 5 people, among them Tom Crean, and they would come with him with one boat with a James Curt to try to get help. The only option was to sail to South Georgia. It's about 800 nautical miles, one of the roughest oceans in the world.
The real torture that he went through, even a few hours in that small boat, in those conditions, trying to survive.
The journey took 17 days.
And they made it. But they landed on the wrong side of the island. Then they had to climb 3 glaciers. I mean, if you think about it, they had no equipment or very little, just a rope and a couple of nails in their shoes. And in a mad dash, made it across and made it to the whaling station in Great Viken. By then, the whole world thought already they were all dead and lost. And eventually, after a long ordeal, managed to save the rest of the crew. The story goes that they never ever doubted that Shackleton actually would come back to save them.
You could see when he came back to the country that the people loved him as a hero.
Generally, I think everybody agrees that his achievements, being the first or having done something that is unique, were not that great. But on any of his 4 expeditions, none of his men died.
His polar contemporary, Sir Raymond Priestley, commented, "For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems to be no way out, get on your knees and pray for Shackleton."
I'm taking this tar paper off, because that was put on somewhere in the 80s. And that will also give us a good idea of how healthy the roof is, because this is really the only unknown part of the cabin which we haven't investigated yet. Oh, wow, that's very interesting. The planking is actually caulked. So it's a raw cotton they hammer into that groove, and they do that with a lot of force. And sometimes they do that 2 or 3 times and put these layers on top of it and compress them really hard. And that way you make the seam waterproof. And it looks like the original caulking. That same rope would have been on the Quest, most likely. This is still the exact same timber as the rest of the cabin. It's just ordinary pine, box standard structural timbers they would have had in the shipyard. Delighted, because I was afraid that there might be some rot there, but it's pretty much perfect. So I'm trying to make the ellipse mirror for the cabinet. I mean, you can do this on the computer as well, but in objects conservation, I think it's good to go through the techniques of how it was done originally. I would say Aristotle did this 2,000 years ago. These are leftover shelves from a historic library that was built in 1903. So I think it's a perfect material to recycle.
Authentication.
Well, it's closer to the real one. I have this keen interest in materials, and wood is one of those fascinating materials. This is the door for the small cabinet. It's made out of recycled material. The idea behind it is not to fake it, but to have something that is close to the original. This was an Edwardian wardrobe, but it was all solid mahogany. Whenever I see a skip anywhere in the country, I generally stop and go for it. I don't know why people throw it away, but maybe they just don't realize what it is. But if you know your materials and your art history a bit, I think you can recognize things quite well. So there was always something visible on the ceiling, some kind of pattern, and it looks like an embossed wallpaper, which is really interesting. So I'm just trying to find out more, because that pattern seems very, very strange. The cabin was built really quickly, they had very little time, so why would you spend your time putting a wallpaper on the ceiling? Maybe it was on purpose, maybe it was just random, maybe it was Shackleton's favorite wallpaper, I don't know. Having read a lot about Shackleton, there's a lot of speculation of who he is, what kind of man he was. And I have the great opportunity to actually meet Alexandra Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton's granddaughter. Hopefully be able to understand a bit more about who was he, yeah, exactly. That's really the big question.
This is one of my favourite photographs of my grandfather. I think you can tell from his photograph he wrote poetry. At one stage he set out the qualities regarded for polar explorer. He put optimism first.
Yep.
Optimism, patience, idealism, and finally he put courage. He thought everyone had courage.
Yeah.
He entered the merchant navy as a 16-year-old in the days of sailing ships.
And when do you think his interest for the polar regions started?
My grandfather realised that though he loved the merchant marine, it wasn't really going to be enough for him. He'd heard about Scott's expedition, Discovery Expedition. Another reason, the oldest reason in the world, he met my grandmother and wanted to make his name so that her father would think he's a suitable son-in-law. So he applied and got the post and was third officer on Discovery.
So Discovery was followed by the Nimrod expedition, which was the second expedition in 1907, which was led by Shackleton himself.
Yes, but he did not get what he most wanted. He did not get to the pole.
We reached a point within 97 geographical miles of the South Pole. The only thing that stopped us from reaching the actual point was the lack of 50 pounds of food.
Possibly could have got there, but they all died there. And his decision to turn back is regarded as one of the great decisions of polar history. We're all defined by our priorities. It's quite clear from them. His priority was his man. He tried to settle down. He got married, became secretary of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. It was quite a stultified institution in those days. I don't think it would have suited him. Ernest Shackleton once said to his little sister, "You cannot think what it is like to tread where no one has trodden before."
I mean, Shackleton had several amazing women around him, including his wife, Emily. She pretty much kept the home ship afloat.
I think she really loved the fact that he was doing successful things that he really liked doing. She must have enjoyed the reflected glory from that. But when he was living in the home and then in his office in London trying to get an expedition going, and when things weren't going well, he took to the bottle and became quite unpleasant in domestic life.
I do not think he was a saint or a hero, which some people tend to think their relatives are, but I do think he was a very great man.
He definitely couldn't take inactivity for long because he had what she called the wander fire, the wanderlust, the call of the wild. My love, I'll be back soon. As soon as it's finished, my love, that'll be the last one.
Yes.
No more. Some people say it shouldn't go on when you've got a family.
Yes.
It's selfish.
In September 1921, he left from St. Catherine's Dock, and the records say that the shores of the Thames were thronged with people waving him goodbye. Of course, nobody knew that was the last goodbye.
After each of his expeditions, he told my grandmother he wouldn't go again. But eventually she realised that was not so. And I believe she wrote in her diary once, "I realise you cannot cage an eagle in a barnyard."
It was always this perpetual move towards the next big project, going somewhere else where he was the happiest. So I don't think he ever wanted a civilian life. The amount of objects left from the Quest expedition are very, very limited. One of them, of course, is the cabin. Another really significant one is the crow's nest.
This barrel still exists in the All Hallows Church in London. Jane Pierce is the curator at the South Georgia Museum and will hopefully help me to understand a bit more about the boss himself.
So, here it is.
Oh, wow. The barrel.
Isn't it fab?
Fantastic.
Do you think that this barrel is as special for being used as a crow's nest on a ship, or is it just a barrel?
I think it's just a bog standard barrel, because you can see there's a plug there. The plug was here next to the plug
to fill it. Liquid?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And also you can see the groove here that would have had the lid set in.
Right.
So it definitely had a lid. And of course, it would have been quite difficult to use as a crow's nest.
Interesting. So it's just a barrel that would have been adapted.
But it would have been very unpleasant to sit in this, I would say. At that height, I mean, just the movement. Imagine this is 25 meters up in the air.
Yeah.
On a very unstable boat.
Swaying. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Seriously strong stomach. On the journey south, the Quest was hit by many really bad storms.
Late decision, cancel the Arctic, go to the Antarctic. As soon as it got out into rough water, which wasn't what an Arctic sealer was designed to do, that's a coast hugger. The weight of the propeller shifting around threw the crankshaft out of alignment.
If
the whole thing's not working, and that's what started happening pretty quickly in the Bay of Biscay. And that led to all the problems, and that led to the stress that Shackleton piled on himself.
And they eventually travelled to Rio de Janeiro to do some repairs, and they ended up being there for about 4 weeks. And so their whole schedule was knocked off course.
When they got to Rio to fix the boat for the third time, George Hubert Wilkins, who was the naturalist on the boat, he was sent ahead to South Georgia to start doing some specimen collecting and research. Wilkins, I know, was disappointed with the lack of interest that he felt the expedition had in the science.
You think it might have not been well communicated, or you think it
I don't think the leadership's heart was in it. And there was a little bit of tension about that.
Okay.
By the time we got to Rio, I think Shackleton had got the sniff of the Antarctic and wanted to beeline it, and so sent the scientists on ahead. They didn't really want to go to South Georgia because South Georgia had been surveyed quite a lot. In fact, in Wilkins' diary, he says, it's been done. Shackleton really wanted to get to South Georgia. If he got a couple of people down there, they're going to have to follow them.
The Quest expedition never got really a huge amount of exposure.
His work schedule was nothing compared with the bravado of what he planned previously.
It wasn't going to be that adventurous. No. They were going to sail the southern seas, but it's not going to the pole.
Even after the Endurance, where they were on the verge of death, a lot of them actually signed up again. Among them, of course, was Frank Wilde, his second in command, who actually was his next-door neighbor in the cabin. Hussey, the famous man with his banjo. Then we had Macklin, his doctor.
By this point, he wasn't very well. He was a heavy drinker, heavy smoker. It was well known that he was suffering.
He was drinking more and smoking pretty well non-stop, so I don't think it was a great preparation for, an Antarctic excursion.
He was desperate to get south. It was almost as if he was holding on.
So in my research on the wallpaper, I contacted Lincrusta. They're in business for over 100 years, and they're doing very luxurious wall coverings. Ooh. Very nice. Michael from Lincrusta found this wall with the wallpaper somewhere in London, and he made this rubber mold. So he took a kind of an imprint of it. To have a mold to make wallpaper, of course, is something very, very special. And until this project, I'd never heard of it, that even exists. to even find the wallpaper was pure luck. This whole project, I think, is one of those magic projects where everything comes together. All the decision-making on objects needs to be based on rock-solid foundations of ethical consideration. I could change it in a way that this object becomes something different. And that's something I think is quite serious, because that way you actually change history and the integrity of the object. Assembly of the bookcase. Talk to the photograph, this was just nailed together, so we're going to do the same thing, so nothing fancy. Got everything positioned, so very soon we can place them all to the millimeter accurate where they used to be. So now it's just a matter of getting the furniture all finished, because we're dealing with objects that represent us and our culture. They're really worthy of every consideration. Then next to the bunk we would have had the little side table with the 3 holes in it, with the water carafe and the funny seat inside. Some people say it's a spud because of his Irish background, but I think that's very thick to actually come up with that kind of idea. First sheet of anaglypta. Wow, turned out perfect. And it's nice and flexible as well. And we're going to make about 10 of those, which should be sufficient to cover the entire ceiling in the cabin. In perspective, this would be up on the wall and you would be looking into the cabin. And that looks pretty much like the bookcase. I have an oil lamp here. They had electricity on the ship. This was, I assume, a backup. And this is roughly the same age, but of course it was not the original one. And it's sitting on a gimbal. It is very, very likely that this was the light he used to write in his diary, including his last entry.
The Scott Paula Research Institute is an absolutely amazing collection of very significant and important documents and objects. And I'm here to meet Naomi Bonham, the Institute's archivist.
So having read through his diaries, what kind of character do you think he was?
His diaries are all very different. Okay. So you get different sides to him depending on which diary you would be reading. The Quest diary is his final diary, is much more of a personal diary. Just looking at it, you can tell it's not the sort of sledging diary that he would carry around with him in his pocket. This is one to be written in a cabin.
Yes.
Possibly at the end of each day.
Yes. So you think it's more reflective on the Quest?
Definitely.
Okay.
All explorers used pencil because the inks can run. Yep. And there is, of course, only 4 days for this diary.
Yes.
On the 1st of January, we've got rest and calm after the storm. The last days of 1920 had not been good weather-wise for them. And he mentions Christmas Day in the raging gale. Seemed out of place.
1st of January, 1922. The year has begun kindly for us. I dared not venture to hope that today would be as it was. Anxiety has been probing deeply into me, for until the end of the year things have gone awry. At 1 p.m. we passed our first berg. The old familiar sight aroused in me memories that the strenuous years have deadened. Ah me, the years that have gone since in the pride of young manhood I first went forth to the fight. I grow old and tired, but must always lead on.
He might have known that he wasn't healthy, that this might be his last journey. Out of almost despair, he kind of runs off after maybe reflecting on his life. I haven't really achieved any major things like his colleagues did.
Certainly not in the best of health, he would have known that, but still wanting to carry on. Going back to the Antarctic in a way is perhaps like going home, which in a way becomes more poignant considering it's literally his last few days.
3rd of January, 1922. Another beautiful day. Fortune seems to attend us this new year. There are 2 points in the adventure of the diver. 1, when a beggar, he prepares to plunge. 1, when a prince, he rises with his pearl.
And then January the 5th, an empty page. Yeah.
Alexandra Shackleton will be coming, and she has never seen the cabin like this, so quite exciting to see what she thinks about it.
By the time they got to the Grytviken, the whaling station, it was the 4th of January. Everyone was super happy. Shackleton came out of this dark cloud and was joyous. In the middle of the night, Shackleton was restless. He couldn't sleep, and he called in Macklin, the surgeon, about half 2 a.m. And then he suffered a huge heart attack and died in his cabin on the Quest.
There we are.
So this one is the ship's log for the Quest.
Wow. 3 a.m. Sir Ernest Shackleton died suddenly of heart failure. Dr. Macklin and McElroy in attendance. Flags at half-mast.
Yes.
So they took his body off the ship. They then left and went on to Antarctica to try and carry out what was remaining of the expedition. And then the idea was that the body was then going to be taken back to Britain. Meanwhile, news had finally travelled back to the UK, back to his wife in London.
Emily decided he ought to lie in South Georgia, the scene of his greatest triumphs, and the place that mattered so much to him.
So they had a lovely small service in the church at Grytviken with lots of whalers present. His grave is very different from the norm. He is pointing south towards Antarctica, to where he thought his soul and his heart truly wanted to be.
I think it's always important as well to have both feet on the ground and just say, listen, it's just a wooden box. That's what it will always be. But in the last 20 years, this was definitely, I think, physically, mentally, the most intense project. Normally, as I said, I never get personally attached to objects, but with the cabin, I definitely had that. I think it's something that touches me emotionally. So that cabin, I think, is quite a bit more than just a garden shed. To give John Quiller Rowett a lot more credit is, I think, quite important. Because without him...
Yep, it wouldn't have happened. He would be very disappointed with the way that it wrapped up the way it did, because it didn't execute, it didn't finish.
They didn't manage to do much. They did some geological work, some meteorological work. They were hit by bad storms again. And And so they made the decision to just head back to South Georgia.
And they, of course, didn't know that he was by then buried, which I'm sure the crew was, I would say, maybe quite happy to say their goodbyes at his grave, yeah.
They decided to then make a cairn as a memorial to Shackleton, and it still stands today on South Georgia on a place called Hope Point.
Ernest Shackleton's death has been described as marking the end of what's called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration.
Back at that time, the polar era was over. Shackleton was definitely the last accepted hero.
Wow. Gosh. And the bunk.
Just to help you look past the famous image, which was taken from exactly position you're in now.
Amazing. He looks wonderful. Oh, this is so beautifully done, Sven. I think he would have been astonished and amused at the enormous amount of interest there is 100 years later.
Yeah. I'm sure you're aware what actually happened on the night. Hussey had his banjo with him. So Hussey actually, in the evening of his death, sat actually there and played a lullaby.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But what I always wondered is, when Shackleton was lying in this cabin and looking up the moment when he passed, what his last thoughts would have been.
It's absolutely evocative of how it was. Just a little over a century since my grandfather died in it.
The night Shackleton died, as I came off watch, passing his cabin, he called out to me, he said, "Huss, I can't sleep. Play me some of the old tunes, will you? They always help me to sleep." So I played him a lullaby.
Lovely.
Yeah.
You know what his last words were? Last entry in his diary?
January 1922. At last, after 16 days of turmoil and anxiety, on a peaceful, sun-shining day, we came to anchor in Grytviken. A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay.
Brian Cox and Robin Ince are back with a witty look at the world through scientists' eyes. The new series of the Infinite Monkey Cage podcast. Listen now on BBC Sounds.